Our forests are home to an astonishing 80% of life on land and abound with an amazing variety of creatures, big and small. You know some of them, others might surprise you. Even the tiniest of creatures play a crucial role, working hard to sustain life, enabling trees and all the other remarkable plants to grow, sometimes even unnoticed. They are the heroes in the circle of life that keeps our planet healthy. But today, this biodiversity is under serious threat. Millions of hectares of forest are being lost every year. We need to care for our only home by caring for our forests.
Welcome everyone to this session, the third sub-session in the UNREDD afternoon session on forest solutions to the triple crisis: food, climate, and COVID-19. These inspiring pictures we've just seen were put together for this year's International Day of Forests. We've highlighted the importance of forest biodiversity, and they're an excellent introduction to this session. This afternoon, that's of course if you're in Europe or in Africa, we will focus on evidence-based transformation of food systems, building upon the Global Forest Resources Assessment 2020 and the State of World's Forest 2020. In the current times in which we battle with COVID-19 across the board, evidence to guide actions has been really at the forefront of government and individual decisions on how to deal with crisis. Evidence is equally critical for us to be focused in using our resources wisely to address the concurrent longer-term crises, and in terms of the climate crisis and of course the loss of biodiversity. And in this session, we have the opportunity to highlight some of the key recent data and insights that can help us in this regard. The UNREDD program that hosts this afternoon session has supported more than 70 countries around the world to establish policy, institutional, financial, and governance mechanisms to reduce deforestation nationally, and evidence, of course, plays a key role in guiding UNREDD support. My name is Astrid Agostini. I'm the coordinator of the REDD Plus and National Forest Monitoring Program in FAO, and I'm a member of the UNREDD Management Group. I'm your moderator for this session. I'm joined by a strong group of presenters and panelists, and I'm glad to introduce these to you now. You have the full biographies of all speakers and panelists in the session site, so I will just do a very brief introduction here. Our panelists, our presenters, so we have three presenters. That is Ms. Mette Wilkie, who is the Director of Forest Policy and Resources Division in FAO, Mr. Anssi Pekkarinen, who is the Senior Forestry Officer in FAO, and Dr. Will Simonson, Senior Program Officer in UNEP, World Conservation Monitoring Center. Mette and Will have jointly coordinated the preparation of the 2020 State of World Forest report. And Anssi is the leader of the Forest Resource Assessment team. So with this triple team of presenters, we will have an excellent overview of the recent insights from these reports. Then we will have a chance to hear from our panelists to give some broad perspectives on the implications of these findings. And we will hear from Tony Simons, the Director General of World Agroforestry, from Rosalind Fossua-Adjei, the Director of Climate Change in the Forestry Commission in Ghana, and from Gabriel Labate, who's the Global Team Leader, UNREDD, in UNEP, Regional Office for Latin America and the Caribbean. Welcome to the session, for which we also have an overall chaperone, which is, of course, Mari Bocucci, who's our secretary, the head of our secretariat in the UNREDD program, who is the host for the entire session this afternoon. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Mette to start us off with the presentation and share the key findings and insights from the reports, the evidence that can help us inform the transformation of food systems. Thank you, Mette, you have the floor.
Thank you, Astrid, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. Why do we want to talk about forests in a series of events discussing food in the times of crisis? Well, I hope this will become clear through the course of this session this afternoon here in Rome. But first, let me briefly tell you about the sources of the data and the messages you're about to see and listen to. The Global Forest Resources Assessment 2020 looks at changes in the world's forest and the way we manage them over a 30-year period, 1990 to 2020. The FRA, as we call it, is a major undertaking, looking at over 60 different indicators and involving all countries across the world. And the results are normally published every 5 years. The State of the World's Forest is published every 2 years with a specific theme. And the 2020 edition was prepared together with the United Nations Environment Programme and its World Conservation Monitoring Center. It looks specifically at the linkages between forests, biodiversity, and people, and takes stock of progress towards relevant global goals and targets. But we also have a third publication here that we will launch next week. It's a study conducted together with Biodiversity International on forest-dependent pollinators and how we can better manage our forests to provide pollination services for both forests and agricultural crops. The presentation today builds on all of these three publications and looks specifically at what they have to say about the linkages between forests and food. And we'd like to convey 5 key messages to you. And I'd like to jump straight to the first one. Feeding humanity and conserving forest ecosystems are complementary and interdependent goals. We have to treat these 2 goals as one. Otherwise, we will not achieve either of them in the long run. And here is why. Our food systems are utterly dependent on forests and their biodiversity. Trees provide shade, shelter from the winds, help recycle nutrients. Farmers know this, and as a result, 40% of all agricultural lands have more than 10% tree cover. 3/4 of accessible freshwater comes from forested watersheds, and that includes much of the water used to irrigate crops. And 3/4 of the leading food crops globally, together representing 35% of global food production, benefit from pollination by animals, many of which live in forests. And lastly, and very importantly, forests help mitigate and adapt to climate change, a role that will become more and more important with time. Forests also provide food security for billions of people. More than 1 billion people depend to some extent on wild foods, be they meat, berries, mushrooms, or fish, and they often contain high levels of micronutrients. In times of crisis, forests are often the only safety net available to the poor and unemployed in low-income countries. But it's not just people in low and middle-income countries who value forest foods. More than 65 million people in the EU collect wild food, and more than 100 million regularly consume it. Much of our food can't be eaten raw, and 2.4 billion people in both urban and rural settings use firewood or charcoal for cooking. That's 1/3 of the global population. In addition, forests provide over 86 million green jobs and many more livelihoods. Ansi, we can't hear you.
I'm sorry, I just lost electricity, but I'm back now.
All right. Over to you.
So the way in which we manage our forests clearly has an impact on the production of food. Now let's have a look at the other side of the coin. How does the way in which we produce our food impact our forests? But first, some key facts about the world's forests. Forests cover some 31% of the total land area, or just over 4 billion hectares. They are found from the far north to the far south, and they are incredibly diverse. Our second message is that despite all the benefits provided by forests, and despite some progress in recent years, deforestation and forest degradation continue at alarming rates. The Global Forest Resources Assessment 2020 tells us that currently about 10 million hectares of forest are converted to other land uses each year. Although the rate of deforestation is down from 16 million hectares per year in the 1990s, we're still losing an area twice the size of Costa Rica each year. When looking at the darkest bars in this figure, representing the period 2010 to 2020, we can see that Africa currently has the highest annual net loss of forests of nearly 4 million hectares per year. It is followed by Latin America, where the net forest loss was significantly reduced during the last 10 years. In Asia and in Europe, the forest area continues to increase through natural expansion or by planting or seeding of trees. However, the forests we lose and those we gain are very different. Most of the forests we gain are found in the temperate and boreal zones, while most of the forests we lose are located in the tropics and subtropics. Our third message is that agricultural expansion continues to be the main driver of deforestation, forest fragmentation, and the associated loss of biodiversity. In fact, large-scale commercial agriculture accounts for 40% of tropical deforestation, and local subsistence agriculture for an additional 33%. However, drivers of deforestation vary between and within regions and countries. In Africa, small-scale subsistence agriculture, in dark blue in this figure, is the main deforestation driver. In Latin America, it is primarily large-scale agriculture, orange in this figure. And in Asia, urban expansion, light blue, also plays a role.
Conversion of forest to agriculture may increase food production in the short run, but it has significant negative impacts on climate change and on the biodiversity of forests, which underpins our food systems in the longer term. So let's look a bit at the status and trends in forest biodiversity and the effects of deforestation and forest degradation. Despite the fact that they cover less than 1/3 of the global land area, forests are home to most of the Earth's terrestrial biodiversity. There are more than 60,000 different tree species. 60% of all vascular plants are found in tropical forests alone. 80% of all amphibian species, 75% of all birds, and 68% of all mammal species all live in forests, as do more than 1 million insects and soil microbes. There are 20 global ecological zones that contain some tree cover. One of the studies conducted for the State of the World's Forest 2020 looked at forest intactness and fragmentation within each of these. This is important to map because when forests become fragmented, we know that this has a profound effect on ecosystem functioning and the connectivity of forests and causes severe biodiversity losses. We also took a deeper look at where changes in forest intactness will have the biggest effects on biodiversity. This map shows forest areas where the species communities themselves remain the most complete, which we call biodiversity intactness, and where they provide habitat for many of the rarest, most range-restricted species, which we call biodiversity significance. And losing forests with high values in one or both of these aspects will have a disproportionately serious impact on biodiversity at the global level. But changes in forest intactness and area are not the only important factors affecting forest biodiversity. A global study of the relationship between forest cover change and populations of vertebrate species doesn't reveal a simple relationship. And that's because there are other important drivers of biodiversity loss, such as unsustainable exploitation. Applying the Living Planet Index approach to data from hundreds of studies of forest-dwelling animals worldwide, we find a decline of more than 50% since 1970. And using this so-called Forest Specialist Index is essential to monitor what is going on below the canopy. But it is not all bad news, and our fourth message is this: solutions that balance conservation and sustainable use are critical and possible. Actions to combat deforestation and illegal logging have gathered pace, thanks in particular to the inclusion of forests in the Climate Change Agreement and the results-based payments for reduction of emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries. And FAO and UNEP are working together with UNDP to make this happen, and you'll hear more about this from one of our panelists in a few minutes. Countries have pledged to restore more than 170 million hectares of degraded landscapes and forests by 2030. HE Biodiversity Target 11 to protect at least 17% of terrestrial area by 2020 has been exceeded for forests as a whole, which will help to both mitigate climate change and to safeguard pollinators and wild relatives of agricultural crops. The State of the World's Forests contain numerous examples and 10 case studies which describe local solutions that combine conservation and sustainable use of forests and their biodiversity to create livelihoods, and through this contribute to greater food security. The earlier SOFO 2016 report showed that it is possible to increase agricultural productivity and food security while halting or even reversing deforestation, highlighting successful efforts of Costa Rica, Chile, the Gambia, Georgia, Ghana, Tunisia, and Vietnam. And the pollinator study also contains a large number of case studies on how to change forest management practices to improve the habitat for pollinators essential for much of our food production. And I encourage you to delve into all of these resources.
We know that the negative trends in forest and biodiversity loss undermine progress towards zero hunger and all the other SDGs. So our last and most important message is this: we must take bold action to scale up successful efforts to reverse the loss of forests and their biodiversity for the benefit of people and the planet. The first bold action we must take is to transform our food systems to halt deforestation. Adopting agroforestry and sustainable agricultural production practices, increasing productivity in an environmentally sound manner, restoring the productivity of degraded agricultural lands, embracing healthier diets, and reducing food loss and waste are all actions that urgently need to be scaled up. And large-scale agribusinesses must help by meeting their commitments to deforestation-free commodity chains. Companies that have not yet made zero deforestation commitments should do so. And commodity investors should adopt business models that are environmentally and socially responsible. These actions will require concerted efforts to ensure that we have effective governance, policy alignment across sectors, secure land tenure, respect for knowledge and rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, and innovative financing modalities. In many cases, this requires a revision of current policies, in particular fiscal policies and regulatory frameworks. This will not be easy, but it is essential and it is possible. In addition to transforming our food systems, we need to manage our forests to ensure positive outcomes for both biodiversity and people. This requires a careful balance between conservation and sustainable use. And we need to repair the damage done to forests and to the livelihoods of the people that depend on them by scaling up restoration efforts so that forests and their biodiversity can continue to support our food systems, conserve biodiversity, and help us mitigate and adapt to climate change. Thank you very much. Here are some lists of where you can get additional information on the evidence underlying the presentation here today.
Thank you very much, Mette, Ansi, and Will for this excellent presentation and very comprehensive overview of the new data and findings related to forest and biodiversity trends and implications that we can learn from these two major reports that have come out and are still coming out in greater depth on the FRA side this year. We really have a chance, I think, to reflect on this now with the panel and see how some of these implications fan out in terms of the priorities that we really need to take this forward. And of course, especially in the context of the theme of the Global Landscape Forum, the highlight on what we need to do in order to feed the planet, to make sure we do that within planetary boundaries and keeping the resources, keeping our natural resources, biodiversity intact, and also making sure that we reduce climate change and greenhouse gas emissions to manage our climate. We have heard, and Tony, I'd like to invite you to come in as a first respondent from the panel, please. We've heard, of course, that from Mette that we need bold action to transform the food systems. And one of the bold actions, I think the first bold action, in fact, that she highlighted was we need to make sure that we use different types of production systems and we really scale up agroforestry, integrated systems, and sustainable intensification. And it would be excellent to hear from you, from your perspective, what some of the good practices are that can be upscaled, and also what you're taking away from these new findings of these reports in terms of prioritization, maybe in terms of doing things differently, or the urgency to move ahead with scaling up some of the success cases that you have already seen on the ground. Tony, looking forward to hearing from you.
Great, thanks very much, Astrid. And thanks tremendously to FAO for organizing this session at the Global Landscape Forum digital event in Bonn. Thanks to Mette and her team for the fascinating presentation. But perhaps the biggest thanks go to the national countries that take the forest resource assessment so seriously and enable us to take that pulse check. Because without a pulse, you can't take a pulse check. And so what are those signals, those pulses that we're seeing from our global forest is like a 4.1 billion hectare iceberg. And this 4.1 billion hectare iceberg is melting. And we're losing 5 million hectares a year. And I think the world's largest iceberg ever recorded was something like 1.1 million hectares, but you get the idea. And that iceberg floated around for 20 years, traveled 10,000 kilometers, and eventually melted away. And our forest is going to go a bit like that unless we take more action. So we have this melting iceberg. If very small bits break off, they quickly disappear and melt away. So the world was once covered with 8 billion hectares of forest. We have 4.1 at the moment. How much do we need? How much do we want, and where should it be? We saw from FRA that most of the loss has been in Latin America and Africa, and the gain in Asia and Europe. So it's not equal across the world in relation to changes in forest cover. Sadly, like icebergs, once we've lost natural forest, it's very unlikely that we're going to get it back. But that doesn't mean we can't get the forest function back. So don't lose hope. Those forest functions of the forest products that we want, the fruit, the timber, the medicines, and the forest services, the hydrological cycling, the biodiversity, the carbon sequestration, and the climate microregulation. And it's those forest products and forest services that smallholders want. In Africa and Latin America, in Africa and in Asia, we saw about half of the forest loss was due to smallholder agriculture. And if they can derive their forest products and forest services from their own farm, from trees they're planting in their own lands that they manage, it will be more sustainable. Because we have this amazing 1.5 billion hectares of cropland and 2.8 billion hectares of pastures and rangelands that make an area even bigger than natural forest. And we can bring forest function to those areas and connect forest fragments with on-farm forest woodlots, with connecting areas of trees. And so the fascinating thing, that the things that we're really seeing, the changes, the dynamic is where communities can see a livelihood benefit from the changes, the way that they manage the landscape, as well as the environmental longer term provisioning aspects of those parts to the biome as well. So it's tremendous to see that push towards now 10% tree cover and at least 40% of agricultural land. And if we can boost that up, we can have those win-win situations for making the landscapes more resilient to change, more resilient to perturbations in temperature, in water, in extreme events. And it is helping those communities see that there's a connection to the natural forest, that, and governments seeing that this tremendous asset value that they have in natural forests can be used and leveraged through local communities. Because if governments who, as in Africa, own 75% of the natural forests on the continent, don't get a revenue from it, don't get an immediate cash return, there's less likely to protect them, to look after them, and to exploit them through their value chains. And that's the change that we're wanting to see. Very excited around new initiatives, global initiatives on forest restoration, but we've got to make sure that there's a business case for that. Because if it's done purely on an aesthetic or environmental, or even on the World's Day that we celebrate biodiversity, we need to make sure that our value chains are sensitive to the needs and the values, the prices, and the costs of those tree product and tree service value chains. So exciting, great to be a member of the panel, and look forward to further discussions.
Thank you very much, Tony, for these observations and for quite a number of pointers that I think we'll be interested to hear also the reflections from the other panelists. And in fact, you've already highlighted some particular aspects that are of key importance in Africa. And of course, we've heard that in Africa, this is where the rate of loss currently is the most urgent. And it's a great pleasure to be able to bring in Rosalind at this stage and to hear, Rosalind, from you with the perspective from Africa, to maybe offer some reflections on how you see this from a regional perspective, how you see this trend and these challenges, and what we can learn, especially also from the experience in your country. You're from Ghana. You have a key policy role in that country, and of course, it's a country that has already made quite a lot of progress in addressing deforestation. Offer us some insights on what has worked, what can be learned, maybe also to replicate in other countries, and how we can bring scale to solutions to make sure we can really hold and reverse this trend. Rosalind.
Thank you very much, Astrid, and hello to everybody who has joined us for this wonderful session. Already a great presentation has been made, and really Tony spoke to a lot of the things that I'm going to really discuss going on here in Ghana. But first of all, I also want to appreciate the GLF for still giving the landscapes a voice, even in this pandemic, going digital. It's amazing, and how we're all connecting around the world. Now, the case of Africa is, as the report presents, I think that it's to be expected in a way, because when you consider the development and investment trajectory, Africa has been sort of at the bottom end. And when you have a lot of production or investment and development going on, of course, the resources that really do suffer are your natural resources. And in this sense, we are suffering our fair share. But what is interesting to note is that Africa has risen up to this realization. And so all across the different programs or initiatives on reducing deforestation and also forest degradation, you'd realize that Africa is positioning itself very strongly. Now, in the UNREDD program, Africa has the highest number of partner countries. Again, also in the GCF program, Africa has quite a number of countries, if not the highest, setting up the nationally designated authorities to position ourselves to access any finance that we can access from the Green Climate Fund. And also this can be said even for the FCPF process as well. So you can see that we have woken up to this realization. And I even think that even though we have the highest net loss of forest, if we get into possibly the main findings of the forest resource assessment later that is going to be published, I believe we can understand that the trajectory that was expected is not as it is now. And so we are making progress, though we haven't gotten there yet. And that is why for a country like Ghana, we have already, and not just Ghana, we have Cote d'Ivoire, we have Nigeria and other countries. We have already started restoring our forests and also enhancing sustainable production of our food crops. And there's this particular instance in Ghana where, as one of our emission reduction programs, we are making sure that we intensify cocoa production. I mean, when you mention Ghana, you know that you're talking about the second largest producer of cocoa beans in the world. And then so cocoa is very important to us. But we have realized that we would have to intensify cocoa production on lands that are meant for cocoa production and remove any illegal production of cocoa in any forest reserve or protected area. Now, we started this program actively in the year 2018, and already results in country indicate that for the year 2019, we have been able to increase cocoa production, and we have also been able to reduce the rate of loss of forest. Now, the World Resources Institute has just published a report which indicates that Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, who are the largest producers of cocoa beans, are currently reducing the rate of forest loss, which is quite interesting for us. And it tells us that whatever we are doing is going to work. And what is also more important and interesting in this, and again, it goes back to the recommendations from the presentation, is that we are not just focusing on these production systems. We are also trying to build resilient landscapes that give the people a voice, that make sure that governance is strengthened, that involves communities and local dwellers more in the management of forest resources and other natural resources as well. We are putting in place structures that safeguard both the people and the environment. And all these systems are most of the time online and transparent, and they are working. And at any point in time, they can be assessed. And this is quite a plus for us. Same is going on, as I mentioned, in other countries around in Africa. And I think that what has really also given us this boost is the commitment from the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, where the governments of Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and then also the private sector chocolate and cocoa companies are saying that we want to remove any deforestation from our value chains or supply chains. And so really, back to what Tony said, it's not just an issue of conservation, but we're also building a business case, because at the end of the day, we must appeal to our investors. If we want to make this case, how do we also ensure the sustainability of the cocoa bean for the companies? And what I also believe is quite interesting and to be brought to the fore is the fact that when we talk about cocoa production in Ghana, mainly it begins as food crop production. And so once we are addressing cocoa production and introducing climate smart practices that enhance the use of tested and proven agroforestry practices, we are also enhancing the production of other food crops, which are grown alongside the cocoa. So I think that if we are able to secure the needed finance, and again, how much finance is really even getting into nature-based solutions in all these climate discussions. If we're able to secure the needed finance to upscale some of these initiatives, the story in the next report for the forest and resource assessment 5 years to come, I'm sure it's going to change and Africa will not be at the bottom. And it's still a learning curve for us, and we believe that we can make a lot of progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosalind, for these observations and for this very, very strong note of being sure that we could turn this around and that we will see a change in this trend in Africa resulting from the action that we're now taking and prioritizing. And it was interesting that you, of course, highlighted the role of finance. Already Tony highlighted this as well. And we had, of course, already a sub-session in our UNREDD segment today that looked particularly at finance and solutions there. So I would encourage all of those that did not have a chance to catch that session to maybe go back in the GLF site and take a look at some of those findings and discussions there. I also wanted to take a chance just as a moment now to also encourage everyone who wants to also post questions in the chat, as well as, of course, to get engaged in social media on the topics, on these key topics that are discussing here this afternoon. You have, of course, your Wova app, and you can directly link into that. And we will be able to maybe take 1 or 2 questions out of that into the panel discussion here. And for any questions we cannot address in the current session, we will be providing a blog piece where we will try after the session to pick up remaining issues that we cannot cover in the session. So please become engaged also in the chat. So leading from a picture from Africa, moving at least geographically to Panama, to Gabriel, who is based there, although he's the global team leader, but he's based in Latin America for UNEP on UNREDD. And Gabriel, we've heard a lot about the importance of really scaled up action, about turning things around. We need, none of this can be done by anyone alone. There's really a critical role for many stakeholders here, and a critical role also for partnerships. And it would be very interesting to hear from you what you see as some of the ways in which we can engage different stakeholders. Who needs to come into play? What kind of role? What role do partnerships play to allow us to really achieve some change and turn this around and build on the progress that's already been made? Because, of course, we already heard in the assessments as well as in the examples that have just been provided that there are good things to build upon and to be able to make some difference. Thank you, Gabriel.
Thanks, Astrid. When I was watching the presentation and when I was listening to the speakers, I couldn't stop thinking about that scenarios can come true. And in our work, we see many times data and potential scenarios, and they are a possibility until they really happen. And COVID has been a reminder to all of us that some of these scenarios can come true, that a global pandemic, perhaps a few years ago, was something that could happen, and actually today it is happening. And I'm saying this because I remember the SARS outbreak in 2002, the swine flu in 2013, and the presentation was really putting together this very strong link between forest habitat loss and the emergence of zoonotic diseases. Now, I was also seeing some statistics that we need action now, and the gap is still very, very important between what we are doing now and what we need to do. If we talk about forest habitat conservation, activities that are aimed at reducing deforestation and forest habitat restoration could contribute not only a lot to minimizing the risk of zoonotic diseases, but also to close the carbon emission gap. And we are really far away from what we should be doing now. Our presenter from Ghana was talking about the need for finance. And at the moment, the finance that, for example, we see available for payments for REDD+ activities is about 2% of what we would require. The good news is that things are changing, and I want to quickly focus on some stories from the private sector. I was one of those that were really happy to see the emerging, very strong signals of ambitions coming from private sector in 2019. This translated in a number of statistics from investments into nature-based solutions, forest solutions to climate change, to a doubling of transactions in voluntary markets, to the UNREDD program in the last 2 years being able to mobilize about $230 million in payments. There were a number of these things coming, and in my 4 minutes, the message that I would like to give to the audience is that we are getting on the right path, but we need to scale up and we need to increase speed significantly. In the UNREDD program, we had a month and a half of discussions with private companies interested in forest-based solutions to climate change. Many of them were telling us it is also about habitat conservation, it is also about biodiversity, it is also about our contribution to minimize the risk of the next pandemic. At UNREDD, and this is the program that I represent in this talk, we are working on that. In the last couple of years, we were able to help countries submit results for the equivalent of about 2 years of the UK annual carbon emissions. We are ready to do much more than that. Countries are ready to do much more than that. Private companies are with us in this journey. So I want to, close with that, Astrid, and thanks for these minutes to share these ideas with you. Over.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, for these observations and also for noting the direction of travel. I think we have this dynamism, that we have the commitments really from multiple groups. We have the governments with their commitments, we have the companies, we have an opportunity really for strong partnerships there, as well as the recognition that although the financing challenge is very strong and very serious, there is at least a much greater conversation going on now in terms of how we can try and overcome that. And I think in the session overall, I think we've had a really interesting opportunity to hear that while I think certainly the insights that we're getting from the reports show that, I mean, there's urgent action needed, and we had that strongly from also the conclusions. The data tells us that we really need to scale up what we're doing, and we really need to be serious, and we need to turn things around. But we have an opportunity now to really capitalize on some of the opportunities that you've all brought forward to have greater synergies also with the activities across the different stakeholder groups and to tie in. But all of that requires that, in fact, things are consistent. And I'm wondering whether I could turn it back maybe for some thoughts also again from Mette, from your side, in terms of the way in which we need to look at the policies that we need to put in place that make sure that we can really have action taking place at scale in order to address these various challenges and to make sure everyone works hand in hand.
Absolutely, and thank you, Astrid. As we mentioned in the presentation, we do need coherent policies, because we know that we're working together towards the 2030 agenda with all the sustainable development goals. But we also know that if we're moving one goal too fast ahead, it may also have an impact on some of the other goals. So there's a lot of synergies, but there's also a lot of trade-offs. So it's important that we look at what they are and how we can minimize those. So clearly we want to have a scenario where you have integrated land use planning, but also where you have policies that are in line with that, where you have subsidies that are promoting sustainable use and sustainable management and conservation of our natural resource exploitation. A lot of work. And I do think that we have a huge opportunity at the moment. We have the COVID pandemic. We know that this will create additional risks on forest, because if people can't move around, or the officials can't move around, we know there's an additional risk that illegal cutting is taking place, simply because people are thinking the government is not there, so let's get on with it. We also know that for those who are leaving the cities, people leaving the big cities because that's where they can fish, they can cut down wood and feed their families. They need to do that. But we also know that there is, with this big economic recession that's following, a huge opportunity to build back better. to step back and saying, well, what is it that we need to put in place in terms of our policies to make this a better world going forward? So I think a lot of governments are doing that. I think also for the stimulus packages, we're finally getting the message across that we do need to look at nature-based solutions going forward. Because if we do that, we can create livelihoods, sustainable livelihoods, and at the same time conserve biodiversity and combat climate change.
Thank you very much, Mette, for these very clear observations. And I think we have some very strong messages here to conclude with in our current session. And as I said, some of the questions that are coming from the chat, we will also be addressing in a blog post afterwards. The key thing really is that the challenge is great. And of course, we have the extra challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic and the recovery that's needed to put in place now. But that really is an opportunity for us. And we need to pass these measures very clearly that, of course, there is no building back better if that means increasing the rate of deforestation. We must hold deforestation as a part of building back better. And of course, that means that the economic stimulus packages and the policies really need to be fully aligned with our international commitments, with the SDGs and with the Paris Agreement and with the commitments on biodiversity. And I think with that, I would like to thank the panelists and the presenters for their very stimulating remarks in this session, and encourage everyone to continue being engaged on these topics on social media through exchange with the groups. We will be continuing to work on this in the UNREDD program and all the partners that have come together here on the panel as well. And we hope that together we can all do our part and make sure we drive the way forward to halt deforestation, conserve biodiversity, and combat climate change. Thank you very much for this great session.